Black Voices in the Shadows of the Big House. I'm Deborah Lustig, Academic Coordinator for the Center for Research on Social Change, and the sponsor of today's event. Tina Sachs, who's the center chair, sends her regrets that she was unable to join us today. If you could please silence your cell phones or anything else that might make noise during the event, that would be appreciated. I want to start by acknowledging that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone people. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with the university values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and our commitment to hold the university more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for the event, the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies here at Cal, and the Townsend Center for the Humanities. The format of today's event is that after I introduce him, Professor Stephen Small is going to talk about his work for about half an hour. Then our respondent, Professor Eula Taylor, will have about 10 minutes to share her reflections on the talk and the book it is based on. And then I'll give Professor Small a few minutes to respond to those remarks before opening it up to discussion with all of you who are here in person, as well as those of you joining via Zoom. If you are joining via Zoom, you can use the Q&A feature to enter your questions, and I will ask those on your behalf. So it's not just because he's my boss, but it is my pleasure to introduce Stephen Small, who is Professor of African Diaspora Studies at UC Berkeley. He's also Director of the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues, ISSI, which is the parent institute of the Center for Research on Social Change. He earned his PhD in sociology at UC Berkeley, where he was a graduate student trainee in what is now the ISSI Graduate Fellows Program. His research analyzes contemporary racial formations and addresses links between historical structures, sometimes literal structures, as in slave cabins, sometimes not so literal, and contemporary manifestations of racial formations in the United States and elsewhere in the African diaspora. Today's talk is based on his most recent book of several books, In the Shadows of the Big House, 21st Century Antebellum Slave Cabins and Heritage Tourism in Louisiana. And those of you who are on Zoom, I think Max is going to put a link in the chat where you can purchase the book if you want. We do have a few for sale, $20 cash or check, or if you'd like to pay via credit card, you can do that as a donation to ISSI. The link is here, issi.berkeley.edu, and you'll see the donate button. Please join me in welcoming Professor Stephen Small.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Deborah. I appreciate those introductory comments. Thank you to the co-sponsors, to Deborah, and to Max, who's organizing the technology, as well as Deborah. Thanks to members of the department, in particular to Eula Taylor, and thank you everyone for spending time today and coming to today's talk. It's not customary to dedicate a talk in the way that we dedicate a book, but I would like to make an exception and dedicate today's presentation to my sister, Carmen, and to her husband, Winston, who live in Canada as part of the Jamaican diaspora, and who are this year celebrating 60 years of marriage, which is quite an accomplishment. Yes, and I do believe that they're on Zoom. At least they were going to try to be on Zoom. So congratulations. When I began my studies as a teenager and in my 20s, it was not my intention to study museums. The museums I had been to in Liverpool offered nothing but crude and monodimensional representations of Black people. Men with spears, bones in their noses, and pots cooking white missionaries. Women who were bare-breasted almost always, subservient and accessible. There was nothing of interest to me. However, circumstance and provocation put me on a different route, and I think this may be the case for other people. What do I mean by this? I mean that in 1992, a multimillionaire who was white Peter Moores, donated £500,000, which at that time was a lot of money, to begin a gallery on the slave trade. There was major disagreement when that announcement was made in Liverpool's Black community over who controls history, who has the resources to write about history, and the ways in which history, and particularly Black people's dignity, Black people's resistance, Black people's rebellion, had been completely annihilated, symbolically or literally, in the course of the British Empire. The Black community, when the announcement was made, fractured in the sense that some people supported the gallery and worked with them to change it. Others disagreed. I continued to work with the gallery. I became a guest curator and also a community representative for several Black organizations in Liverpool. I relocated to the United States in the 1990s, and I was doing research in Atlanta, Georgia in 1996, just before the Olympics. And the state of Georgia had a massive campaign to persuade the millions of people who had arrived for the Olympics to stay in the state and do tourism after the Olympics has ended. I was surprised to see the images of plantation structures that still existed. Georgia, after all, is the home of Gone with the Wind and the site Tara. I was startled to find that there were slave cabins, and I was shocked to see that these so-called slave cabins, huts, hovels, and houses were overwhelmingly neglected, as was the agency of Black people. Almost no attention, and if there was attention, it was misrepresented, to the efforts by Black women and men and children to resist slavery, to achieve self-respect, to maintain their dignity, and to survive and succeed. I began research then on what I called plantation museum sites. I no longer call them museums. I now call them heritage sites. I think to call them museums gives them a status that they don't deserve. And in 2002, I published a book with my colleague Jennifer Eichstadt on representations of slavery in plantation museum sites. We looked at 120 plantation museums in Virginia, Georgia, and Louisiana. Okay. During that research, we discovered that 25 to 30% of these sites possessed slave cabins. The majority of them did not have the slave cabins on show. They were typically in the back, often just used for storage, misrepresented, and generally ignored. After I finished that research, I determined to ask the question, what do museum sites look like? What do heritage sites look like if we put the lives of Black people first and foremost, and if we look at the cabins rather than the big houses? With the support of a Berkeley sabbatical and the support of my department, and actually with funds also from the Townsend Center for myself and for some graduate students in the department, I spent the next several years studying slave cabins. I traveled to 10 states. I visited 71 plantation heritage sites, and those 71 sites from Louisiana to Maryland included sites with 139 cabins. I chose to focus on Natchitoches. Let's see. No, okay, well, that should be, okay, so that's the background, so I think we've done that, yeah, okay. Oh yeah, so now it's working, okay. So I chose to focus on Natchitoches for several reasons that I'll share with you shortly. My book, which has just been published, focuses on just one location, although I've written several journal articles on some of the other sites across Louisiana and also sites across the US to examine what do they share in common and how do they differ. Okay. Between 2007 and 2013, I spent a substantial amount of time in Louisiana, in Natchitoches, which is the best way I can pronounce it. They locally pronounce it differently. Natchitoches is, let me see, does this work? Maybe not. But Natchitoches is up here. It's just less than an hour from Shreveport. It's northwest Louisiana, and it's about 5 hours drive from New Orleans. Okay. The book is based on the work in Natchitoches, which is a city and a parish. And the book is called The Shadows for two reasons. And by using the word shadow, I have two things in mind. Clearly, number one, obviously, is cabins that are outside the big house, so-called the plantation mansions, and exist in the shadows of those mansions. But also what I demonstrate in the book is that there were very substantial and significant spaces within the big house and within other structures, in shadows, in basements, in lofts, in attics, in rooms of the so-called master enslavers. And therefore, I want to bring that to the attention of people too, in what I call a continuum of accommodations in which enslaved people lived. Okay. Why did I focus on Natchitoches? Well, first of all, it's a major tourist regional center in Louisiana, which represents itself as the original French settlement in what became the state of Louisiana after they had wrestled the land from the indigenous population. Natchitoches has three major heritage sites with 16 what I call 21st century antebellum slave cabins and a number of other spaces. And I'll give you a definition of an antebellum slave cabin in a moment. The three sites reveal variations in their treatment and representations of slavery and the cabins. And they also vary in their modes of management. Two of them are public and one of them is private. Does that mean? No, that's not me. Okay. Natchitoches also has a rich set of primary data and evidence for the origin and growth of the sites. And slavery and its legacy in Louisiana, especially outside New Orleans and the sugar parishes, have not attracted significant attention in the way that cotton and other crops have elsewhere in the South. These are the goals of the study: to examine the contemporary social organization of the heritage sites. And I do want to emphasize that this research was conducted between 2007 and 2014, more or less, with some help from research assistants. So this is really a statement of what existed back then. And I know that there have been developments. Some are better, some are worse since then. Representations of slavery in the cabins at the sites are all explicit and substantial. One of the sites, Melrose, has the dubious distinction of being owned and run by legally free people of color that owned enslaved people themselves. And they owned at least 280 enslaved persons at their peak, which was around the 1830s and 40s. And I asked what I realized after a while was a very naive question, which is, are representations at the site any different? They are different from the other sites, but not in the ways that I expected. I believe this is the first book on the role and treatment of slave cabins in contemporary heritage tourism, and certainly one that addresses legally free people of color, so-called mulattoes, a word that I dislike and repudiate. Okay. Natchitoches, as a tourist center, promotes a series of themes: the lifestyle and legacy of Creole families. It highlights the distinctive multi-tiered racial hierarchy that prevailed in the region, whites, blacks, and free people of color, and presents itself as different from and superior to the binary system of blacks and whites that existed across the rest of the US South. It highlights agricultural plantations, working communities, and lifestyles. It highlights prominent local families, some of whom, like the Prudhoms, have owned plantations for generations, in fact, for more than a century. And it highlights notable local individuals, typically whites or people of color, including several exceptional women: Camille Henry, Marie-Therese Kwan, and Clementine Hunter, who I'll come back to in a short while. What's a 21st century slave cabin? It's a cabin built originally in the antebellum period, primarily for habitation by enslaved persons, which has survived overwhelmingly, having been restored or reconstructed into the 21st century. The idea of a 21st century antebellum slave cabin captures some of the contradictions reflected in the heritage sites. Temporal dimensions built in the antebellum period, still in use in the 21st century. Spatial dimensions at the back or at the side of the big house. Clearly racialized and gendered dimensions, elite whites in the big houses and mansions, enslaved Black people and others in the cabins, and highlights also structured and systematically gendered and racialized spaces, typically in terms of production and reproduction, in terms of what kinds of spaces men and women are, boys and girls are presented as. Overall, all of these issues convey what I call the irrepressible dimensions of authority, power, and resource imbalances. And these are the issues that interested me when the gallery began and became a museum in Liverpool. The contestations over who controls the history of these areas. Instead of focusing only on slave cabins, I put cabins in a context which I call a continuum of coerced accommodations. And I describe them and differentiate them into two clusters. And in basic terms, one cluster are the so-called typical cabins, cabins built as separate structures for the lives of those people who are enslaved. And here you see the numbers of cabins at these different sites. There are also some cabins which were actually transformed and represented, not as slave cabins, but as the cabins of white occupants in the 20th century. And I'll come back to that shortly. But secondly, and importantly, there are many structures and spaces at these sites and in sites across the US in which it was common practice for enslaved persons to live or sleep. Many enslaved persons, particularly women, slept in the main house at each site. They slept in the cook's house. Cook's houses were typically built as separate structures because of the threat of fire. And they slept in blacksmith shops, carriage houses, in hospitals, so on and so forth, kitchens also. And the idea of this continuum moves us beyond the binary of cabins and non-cabins, and highlights the greater race, gender, social interaction than does a focus on distinctive structures on their own. Overview, I think I'll go through this quickly. Slave cabins are explicit, I've mentioned that. Their role in the economy is explicit. Some attention to gender is paid in tours and leaflets and video representations at the sites. Some distinctions are made between white men, particularly elite white men, enslaved Black and mixed race women. We see a range of images and mention in these various media, literature, signposts, cell phone tours with descriptions of their lives. And we hear and see information about cabins and Black people, though the information about the cabins and Black people is consistently secondary to the lives, culture, housing, and experiences of elite whites. In other words, mention is frequent and consistent, but always, almost always, Melrose is an exception, inferior. And a variety of tactics are deployed to marginalize, neglect, and symbolically annihilate the lives of Black women and men through tactics of silence, evasion, and euphemism. Okay. The two sites, Oakland and Magnolia, use strategies that I call relative incorporation. And Jennifer Eichstadt and I defined this concept. Slavery and the lives of the enslaved are described explicitly, systematically, and are incorporated into overall presentations. However, they remain secondary in focus, content, detail, and attention to the lives of elite white men and women. Some examples would be elite white men and women. We hear about their lives, their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations. We hear their names. They are humanized and personalized. With Black people, we hear nothing about their hopes, or almost nothing about their hopes and dreams, their lives, the kinds of lives they live. Okay, we get very passive and offensive references to Black women or Black men who worked as cooks. In fact, the vast majority of time, well, not vast majority is the wrong word. The few times in which Black women are mentioned, it's almost always in the kitchen when we hear stories about individual cooks. In one or two instances, we did hear the name of a Black person, but when you compare it to the amount of humanizing and personalizing information on elite whites, it's clearly inferior. These are some of the some photographs that I took at Oakland Plantation. You have the with this, let me see, this should work. It doesn't matter. The middle photo is the main house. The main house at each of these sites gets far more attention than any other house at the site. And this is where we hear about the lives and hopes and dreams and etc. of the elite whites. There are two so-called slave cabins, both original. Both have received very substantial reconstruction, tens of thousands of dollars, maybe more than $100,000 on each of them to bring them into the site. And then there you have the cook's cabin. It's clear that the cook was female and that she, different cooks over time, and that she lived and slept in that cabin. Magnolia has 8 original brick slave cabins. Brick was not a common material used to build slave cabins, except in Maryland, where there are brick, actually stone cabins. So these are exceptional. They're not entirely unique, but they are exceptional. And they are, well, let me see. These cabins are not in their original places. Over the years, by chance or by accident or by design, the cabins have been moved around different sites for purposes of recreation or accommodation, for example, after slavery was legally abolished. I think these may be in their original site, and they are called a slave village or slave quarters. I show you the inside. When I began research in 2007, this is what was going on inside. But you know, with the requirements of human subjects, I obviously had to tell them I was a researcher. I had to tell them I was from Berkeley, and that clearly had an effect. They often commented on how they'd like to change things, how they'd like to do more things about Black people and women, but they don't have resources, which is largely true. They have limited resources. And also it's clear that some exhibits were installed and things happened because of my presence. This is what academics call researcher effect. We're supposed to avoid it. I don't know that we can, but and I think that's okay. So that's the first 2 sites. The third site, Melrose Plantation, I describe it as using a narrative of symbolic annihilation. The site marginalizes the institution and experience of slavery. It treats it in ways that are negligible, formalistic, or fleeting. Slavery is everywhere and nowhere, in the sense that images of the cabins and other buildings abound. We hear mention of slavery, but the slave cabins are overwhelmingly treated as postbellum and as 20th century cabins. They appear primarily as the work and living spaces occupied by white writers and artists in the 1930s, long after slavery was abolished, in what was called a writers' colony that was established by Cammie Henry, whose husband had bought the plantation, and after he died, just before he died and certainly after, she turned it into a writers' colony. Here's some images, again, photographs that I took. You see the main house. There's a tour of the main house. The bottom left is Yucca House. Many of these buildings are in dispute. The site argues that Yucca House is the original habitation of Marie Therese Kwankwan. Several local archaeologists published books and, well, not books, published journals that dispute this claim, although the site continues to say that Marie Therese Kwankwan, the original so-called matriarch, lived there. The bottom right is a slave cabin that was brought in by Cammie Henry from a different site in the 1930s, and she used it as her weaving cabin, and it's described as a weaving cabin. Maybe in passing they mention it was an original slave cabin, but that gets little attention. This is one of the most stunning buildings on the site. It's also subject to tremendous, not tremendous, but very significant dispute. It's called the African House, and there's dispute over its origins and what it represents. The site says it's typical of African houses in West Africa and Southwest Africa. Several archaeologists and anthropologists argue it has nothing to do with Africa. It's typical of French houses in, I think, the 17th and 18th centuries, and that's the case, they argue. The site continues to represent it. It's very stunning, as you see, and upstairs you go in, and there are a series of murals that were painted by Clementine Hunter. This is the Garner House. Again, there's a dispute over whether it represents a French architectural style or an African style. It was named by a white man called Francois Mignon, or rather, he called himself Francois Mignon. He claimed to be from France. He argued that he had escaped because of the First World War, and he was central to promoting the site, to writing documents, to writing leaflets, and he gave the name to this house. It turned out later that his name was Francis Mignon, that he was born in New York, and that he had lied. He had lied the entire time. And there's documentary evidence of that. And this is a clear example of white privilege and his ability to lie and to get away with it. And this truth was not revealed, at least not publicly, until after he died. This is a cabin, not a slave cabin, but a cabin from the 20th century that Clementine Hunter lived in. She lived in this cabin off the site. She moved to a different cabin. It was brought to the site. It's on the site. It's not part of a tour, but the docents made it available to me at request. Okay. Melrose is the most complicated because slavery is everywhere and nowhere. Women are everywhere and nowhere, but gender analysis is absent. Elite and exceptional women are highlighted, but in ways that privilege traditional lifestyles. They are celebrated for their marriage, for raising children, for the sacrifice for their children. They are celebrated for idiosyncrasies, like Cammie Henry bringing in the cabins and dedicating her life to documenting the history of the region. And Hunter is presented as unique, odd, quirky, and eccentric. So there are, as you can tell, significant problems in these representations. These are some of the underlying narratives. I think I've mentioned this, and I don't think I'll repeat that. At least not all of the points. The basic argument being that there is a preference, an overwhelming preference in representations of elite whites, and Black people are neglected. Various stereotypes of good slave masters and faithful slaves. Almost every site you go to argues that that plantation was a good slave master and that other plantations had bad slave masters. These kinds of representations that Jennifer and I documented in our book. Okay. Why are the sites like this? Well, according to the staff, they say it has to do with visitor priorities. They come to the sites to see the main house, not the slave cabins. It has to do with resource limitations, limited funds for research, or to mount creative exhibitions. I argue it has to do with racial inequality because these sites are not the priority of Black people in rural Louisiana who are still confronting ongoing segregation, discrimination, and institutional racism. The fact that the sites are owned by the National Park Service mean that they do get some resources, and they are relatively better than sites elsewhere in Louisiana because they have to go through a process of consultation and communication with the community. I also argue that they are like that because they have a limited involvement of Black people. There are some individual Black people, but there are very few Black organizations who are actively involved. And if you compare these sites with sites that are owned and managed by Black people across the South, you see fundamentally different representations, fundamentally different narratives. Clementine Hunter offers a different set of insights. She is presented in a very limited number of ways at the sites. But when you scratch the surface, she presents great potential for a systematic critique of what's going on at the sites and for centering the lives and agencies of Black people in general and of Black women in particular. Clementine Hunter was born in the Natchitoches region. They don't know exactly what the date was. She left school at the age of 8, began working as a field worker, picking cotton alongside her father. At age 15, she began working at Melrose Plantation. During her lifetime, she had 7 children, 2 of whom died in stillbirth. In the 1920s, aged in her 30s, she began working in Cammie Henry's big house as a cook and cleaner and servant. Also in the 1920s, she began painting and over her life produced an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 paintings on canvas, cardboard boxes, ironing boards, wooden roofing shingles, lamps, buckets, and a lot of other materials. She also did sewing and produced numerous quilts. She painted the African house murals when she was in her 60s. I'll show you some images of them shortly, at the suggestion of Francois Mignon, and she died in 1988. She has achieved various acclaim in the last stages of her life, and after she's died, she received an honorary Doctor of Arts at Northwestern State University. This is not Northwestern in Chicago, but Northwestern in Louisiana. She was invited to the White House. She respectfully declined because she didn't like to travel. She has had shows in various areas, and according to some on-site material, the Louisiana state legislators designated October 1st as Clementine Hunter Day. This gives you an example of some of the biographies that exist, that give you some of the general information about her life and about her work. Melrose represents Clementine Hunter as an important folk artist. They show her original paintings. They talk about various aspects of her work and her life, overwhelmingly as an unusual, idiosyncratic, and odd and amusing character. She's presented as a highly exceptional Black woman. She was actually of mixed origins. A paternal grandparent and a maternal grandparent had Native American and some white ancestry, but she's typically overwhelmingly represented as somebody Black. She painted colorful women's drawers as a joke. She said women on the plantation supposed to wear white drawers. She pointed out. So these are the kinds of things that you hear when you're doing the tour. There's a lot of laughter. There's a lot of joke. It's a contradiction in the sense that she gets more attention than Black women at any other site, because overwhelmingly we only hear about Black women working in the kitchens. And yes, it's highly problematic. At the same time, Mignon gets praise, especially as agents, as providing materials, as promoting her, and they are juxtaposed. There's a significant number of tourist art, cups, paintings, and so on, books in the shop. These are images that you see in the main house. As you're walking by, they just point out this is Clementine Hunter, this is Francois Mignon, this is in the basement. Clementine Hunter's self-representation, I argue, is very different from the plantation heritage sites representation. In her work, Black people are always first and foremost, especially Black women, and she's engaged directly in what we would call gender, race, politics. Her work overwhelmingly is a celebration, documentation of Black life. Work, church, family, home, play, Black joy are celebrated. Black people are named. For example, there's a so-called, a person called Uncle Israel. And as you know, it was common condescendingly to call elderly Black people, and young Black people too, Uncle. Uncle Israel gets virtually no mention in the site, but he's in several of her portraits. The cabins also get primary focus too over white spaces, and in practice, white people are marginalized or absent. These are the African house murals. You see the women are working. The African house is at the back. Several others here, you see the women are working and the men are lazing around. This was part of her analysis of the gender politics of race. It's nice and simple and very effective. You see this guy's lazing about. It's common, we are told, in folk art to, and particularly in Clementine Hunter's work, to have the women as larger than the men, because the women are more important than the men. And you get an idea. I know I've got about 5 minutes left still. Okay. This one I like a great deal. This is the portrait. This is a closer image. This is Clementine, Cami Henry's son. And he was a particularly unpleasant plantation, not slave driver, because it was 20th century. The plantation docent said she did not think very highly of him. I think it would be more accurate to say she had complete contempt for him in terms of how he worked people, particularly Black women. And it's passed over as something relatively trivial. But I think the fact that she paints him so tiny communicates her feelings in an effective way. What is my representation of Clementine Hunter? What is her potential? She presents Black and mixed voices and visions. which are foregrounded and explicit. Paintings are a challenge to white hegemony and priorities. Her priorities, as I've already mentioned. And she documents her life as a Black woman and the lives of Black women in Jim Crow America, because at the site, these issues are completely decontextualized. The fact that Black women are suffering under Jim Crow practice and legislation is almost an aside, and that's achieved by focusing on individuals rather than the context. And here, academics, watch your back. What does that mean? In the book that I published with Jennifer Eichstadt, we told a story that we heard at the plantation. Clementine Hunter did not paint white people. And apparently one of the plantation owners went to her and said to her, if you do not paint white people, we are going to fire you. It seems that she didn't get fired, but we put that in the book because that's what we heard. Not long after the book was published in 2002, I got a registered letter from a court in Louisiana, which I opened, and it had a statement saying, we repudiate this claim. Clementine Hunter was not treated like this, and we reject it. And people said, what are you going to do? I'm not going to do anything. It doesn't require me to do anything. I'll wait and see. They haven't charged me with anything. And it's in the book. And, you know, I don't know, maybe someone watching now might say something. Anyway, that's what we were told. So, you know, so do watch your back, because they are watching. Okay. I want to finish with a couple of other issues. There are other African-American sites that are managed or owned or organized by African-Americans in Louisiana and elsewhere. So although the heritage sites dominate in number and resources, Black people, African-Americans refuse to be silent and refuse to be passive. In fact, this one, the River Road African-American Museum, was set up by a Black woman from LA, whose family is from Louisiana. Their name is mentioned in the book. And she was horrified when she spent some time in Louisiana to see these sites and organize this museum. Anna Bontemps Museum in Alexandria celebrates the life of Anna Bontemps, or Bontemps. There are museums that are organized by African Americans in Virginia and in Macon, Georgia. This is one of my favorite ones. If you haven't read the book, Running 1,000 Miles to Freedom by Ellen and William Craft, you should download it now. It's a fantastic story of escape. And the punchline is they got away. I was like, they got away. It's not always the case. You can download that book, I'm sure, for free on site. So there's a relevant Black feminist work on heritage sites. These several Black women, Singleton, Franklin, I don't know about Nedra Lee. Franklin was a graduate student in anthropology here, actually, at Berkeley in the 1990s. Offer insights into museum and heritage sites and argue that substantial changes could be made if the sites gave up on this criterion that they can only show material that is original to the sites, because all the sites say, we would like to show a lot more, but we don't have the material. What could change in the short and long run? Things could be done without resources. They could have more details on the lives of the majority. They could pay greater attention to other accommodations, pay more attention to the cabins. The tour guides play a very important role. However, fundamental change would require challenging the underlying grand narrative. Also, if you had more information about slave cabins, more visitors would come. Black people and others don't go because there's so little information, is my argument. Okay, do I want to do that? Yeah, let me just jump to the conclusion because of time. Okay, so all three sites pay significant attention to slavery in the cabins. The Southern gentility narrative prevails. Two sites use relative incorporation, one symbolic annihilation. Opportunities do exist to be more inclusive. Clementine Hunter refuses to be what the sites want her to be, and Black voices and visions can transform these sites in ways that would be highly productive and make them more accurate and more inclusive. Thank you.
Let me just introduce. Oh, sure. Be a little bit formal. Thank you for that rich glimpse into the book. I know that was only just one section of the book. To get us started on our discussion, we're now going to hear from Professor Eula Taylor. Eula Y. Taylor is Professor of African American Studies here at UC Berkeley, and in the interest of time, I'll just share a few tidbits from her impressive bio. She earned her doctorate in American history from UC Santa Barbara, and her research focuses on African American women's history and feminist theory. She is the author of numerous books and journal articles, which have appeared in journals including the Journal of African American History, Journal of Women's History, Feminist Studies, and Souls. Welcome, Professor Taylor. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Stephen, for writing a wonderful book that I enjoyed reading. I want to begin my remarks today with a TikTok video. And so I'm going to start with the video.
Not okay in the least bit. And I know there's going to be somebody that says, oh, you're looking for controversy where it doesn't exist. No, this is an 1830s slave cabin that is up on Airbnb as a bed and breakfast. How do I know that this is slave quarters other than just using my eyes and looking at it? Well, they say it in the listing. This particular structure, the Panther Burn Cabin, is an 1830s slave cabin from the Panther Burn Plantation. How is this okay in somebody's mind to rent this out, a place where human beings were kept as slaves? Rent this out as a bed and breakfast. Here it is. That's it right there, the slave quarters next to the big house. It's in Greenville, Mississippi. That's the host, Brad. But what really kills me is reviews. Memorable. Highly recommend watching The Sunset. We stayed in the sharecropper cabin and ate in the main house. Enjoyed everything about our stay, the cottage, the history, the tour, the breakfast, and all was great. We stayed in the cabin, and it was historic but elegant. A slave cabin is elegant. What a delightful place to step into history, Southern hospitality, and stay a night or two. Cool spot, way better than a hotel. Maybe you're thinking, okay, maybe this will give people insight on how enslaved people had to live, their living conditions. No, not at all. Clawfoot tub, running water, tile, nice lighting fixtures, water, towels, dresser. The history of slavery in this country is constantly denied, and now it's being mocked by being turned into a luxurious vacation spot.
I wanted to start with this advertised Airbnb slave cabin. Because, in my opinion, it sets the stage for Stephen Small's book, In the Shadows of the Big House, 21st Century Antebellum Slave Cabins and Heritage Tours. It is so important and it is so timely. What is at stake when former cabins are advertised as sites of leisure? When a former cabin becomes a site to practice yoga and Pilates? What is at stake when former plantation fields where market crops of cotton, tobacco, indigo, hemp, and rice are cultivated are now advertised as gardens where rest and rejuvenation are possible? Where has the slave culture of violence, brutality, and exploitation gone? Small's book demonstrates on multiple levels how heritage tours of antebellum slave cabins and plantations are framed around forgetting all of the horrors of slavery. Natchitoches, Louisiana is the parish where 3 plantations, Oakland, Magnolia, and Melrose, are the sites for this national forgetting. Or as Small insightfully states, quote, underlying all of these issues are questions about how power and access to resources lead to certain kinds of social remembering and social forgetting. What Small documents with ethnographic precision, historical methods, and sociological insights are the growth and unevenness of heritage tours that center on the preservation of 16 21st century slave cabins. I appreciate that Small is clear that these are in fact 21st century slave cabins. Many of them have been moved to these sites as a way in which to stage slavery
without talking about Black people and the traumatic suffering they experienced in the so-called peculiar institution. The movement of these cabins onto the plantation for tourists anchor the performance. That is, the cabins were built to house the enslaved, and how can you have a real plantation without one? Time and time again, Small provides evidence of how the main house is the drawing card for the tourist. The large physical structure that housed planters in luxury brings excitement and meets the expectation for tourists who are longing for an antebellum past. At the Oakland plantation, Small analyzes, quote, how if it had not been for the intervention of the National Park Service, it is highly likely that the representation of the Oakland plantation history at the site in the 21st century would have been far more nostalgic, conventional, and distorted than what it actually became. Small tells us that many of the tourists at these plantations only visit the main house and the gift shop. I found myself lingering on Small's sentence, quote, school groups often visit and depending on the circumstance, toured the grounds or visited just the main house. How sad that school groups on field trips to plantations don't even tour the small exhibits on slavery inside the cabins. I wondered what they took away from their experience and how the teachers filled in or not the history of slavery. Limited staffing and resources, small details impact these heritage sites. For me, the uneasiness of the heritage tours were reflected in the self-guided tours or the ones that were led by either highly informed docents or those who felt extremely confident offering description void of evidence. For example, at the Melrose plantation, Small recounted how one docent became an instant art historian of Clementine Hunter's work. Small writes, quote, the docent highlighted one mural in which all of the women are working and the men are not. The docent added that by the end of her life experience, Hunter had come to conclude that, quote, men were worthless. Another docent, Betty, quote, told us she was going to do an impersonation of Maria Therese Coin and narrate a story. She didn't tell us the source of the story, Small quotes. While Small gives us the narrative of Betty, I wondered what it was like to have a docent perform the embodiment of Coin. One of the hallmarks of Small's book is the history of slavery on the very plantation that he is writing about. One learns about how the plantations functioned during and immediately after slavery. Who were the owners, including free people of color who owned slaves? This historical work provides a context of the heritage tours that are so needed, and I'm hoping that this book will now occupy the gift shops at each of these sites. One of the most surprising aspects of the Melrose plantation was under the ownership of Cammie Henry. Cammie, during the 1920s and 30s, transformed the plantation into a writers and artists colony. These writers, some of whom would become prominent, lived on the plantation for short and long periods of time, and some of them occupied the former slave cabins. I appreciate that Small points out the word slave becomes removed, and now there are only cabins. I began my comments with a video detailing the advertisement of an Airbnb slave cabin. Small's insightful scholarship exposes that this current moment is not the first time that the range of buildings and spaces in which enslaved people lived and slept are used as if enslaved people never lived or slept there. Herein lies one of the many scholarly gems in Small's book. His concept of continuum of coerced accommodation. Small pushes us to shake loose from the binary of slave and non-slave accommodation as a point of analysis. His concept brings together the plantation geography and the social and physical proximity of enslaved people to those who legally dominated them for all of their life. Thank you, Stephen, for laboring to write a wonderful book that I can only imagine must have conjured up so many emotions for you. Every time your shoes touch the earth that is saturated with the culture of violence must have left your soul weary. Perhaps during the Q&A you can talk about the emotional toll of this work on you. Thank you.
Let me respond. I'll try to respond briefly. Look, first of all, thank you for that fantastic articulation of some of the key issues. I certainly would like to get a copy of those notes.
Okay.
I can put them to use. Insightful, incisive, and actually quite lyrical. And there's nothing in there that I disagree with. I appreciate it very much. You clearly spent time. It is very offensive, and we found it offensive, Jennifer and I, that there are bed and breakfasts and have been bed and breakfasts and slave cabins used as bed and breakfasts. Jennifer and I first did research in Louisiana in 1994, and they already had cabins then as bed and breakfast. You may be aware that there are frequently weddings and various dances and balls and events at these sites. Do Black people take part in them? I'm pretty sure they do. But my clear impression overwhelmingly that it's non-Black people. In the book that we published in 2002, we called the slave cabins plantation chic. It was meant to be a sarcastic comment on, the idea that you could go and stay in one of these cabins and so forth. So this is, highly problematic. Overall, it's another element in what I described in the previous book with Jennifer in this book as the symbolic annihilation of the lives of Black people, women and men and children, their labor, their agency, and in two realms in particular. One, as my colleague Eula pointed out, in terms of the horror, the brutality, the violence of quotidian life, but also fundamentally, as she pointed out too, in terms of Black people's quest for family, for dignity, for respect, and for community. A lot of these things are almost totally absent. In this book, I call this the institutionalization of neglect. That's what's going on for a variety of reasons. And then two last points. These issues clearly, I hope I conveyed, have tremendous class dimensions. You note I spoke overwhelmingly about elite white people. Poor white people are occasionally mentioned. Okay? And one of the things that happened, things develop you don't anticipate. And one of the things that happened is it became clear at the start that many people didn't think that I was Black. They couldn't process race and Englishness. And I realized that this was an advantage. And in all the research as I developed it, I tried to get my accent out as early as possible and do what Minka's called, my good friend Minka's called, use my resources. And what happened is people would frequently talk about England, and they would frequently apologize for not having buildings as old as Britain. Unfortunately, I didn't take the opportunity to mention that if you looked at Native American buildings, you may find that you have some things older than Britain, but I decided it prudent to avoid that. Final thing I want to say is my department is currently advertising a position for the afterlives of slavery. I believe that's an assistant professor. This is one important dimension. There are many other dimensions of the afterlives of slavery, but a friend of mine once at a presentation in the Netherlands said to me, slavery is like Dracula. It's dead and buried, but it won't lie down. Anyway, it won't stay dead. So once again, thank you, Eula, and I appreciate your comment. Oh, the emotional toil. Yeah, what do you say? I don't know. the field work, I spent several summers, and my partner and wife, Angela, actually spent a full summer there doing research as well in the early part of this century. It is intense. You have to have a lot of wherewithal not to comment when people say things that are clearly inaccurate or offensive. This is, you have to remain silent and stoic as part of the research. It's kind of tough to get the information out. How did I deal with it? Well, I have cousins in Florida and in Georgia, and after doing 2 or 3 weeks in Louisiana, I drive, 600-700 miles, and I'd spend a week or two with them. That was part of it. The emotional toil afterwards, it's something I have to think about. These are things we've been dealing with all our lives. I think about, the abuse that my mother went through as a white person who married my father, who's black, and the emotional toil. Yeah, it's something. Yeah, I don't know how best to articulate that. It is painful. Yeah.
I remember outrage and just again like desperate sadness. Like I remember one tour docent saying that they would stomp on the floor for the wet nurse, and I'm thinking there's somebody in the root cellar, and they're called 24 hours a day, probably not just the nursing with a stomp, just the darkness, the damp.
That's right. And people would laugh.
Yeah,
people would laugh. They said we needed someone from you stomp and somebody and that. Go ahead, yeah.
No.
That's it. The other one.
Outrage, I was angry a lot.
I think I was. Yeah, I must have kept it calm.
And also just profoundly sad, just ancestral loss, ancestral suffering.
It was the other example. In the book, I do provide some examples of what I call the use of passive language to avoid personalizing enslaved people. So a common comment was that when they didn't have thermometers and they wanted to know if the oven was hot enough, a hand would be placed in the oven. And you know whose hand that would be. The other thing was the whistler's walk. So because the kitchens were built outside the house to prevent the enslaved person bringing the food to house from eating the food or sampling the food, they'd have to whistle and people would laugh. So yeah, so I must have been outraged. I'm keeping myself calm.
Okay. Thank you. Want to open it up to questions from the audience? Deborah, go ahead.
Thank you both. It's terrific work, essentially. My first association is in contrast to this whitewashing of the past. And I would say another, not institutionalization of neglect, but something more violent than that, another annihilation. The parallel is, or the opposite, are prisons that are built on top of plantations. And I heard of that. It's so reminiscent of Foucault, different stages, but I think it's that interesting comparison. The other thing is, first of all, there was no showing of the inside of any of these buildings. Is there a reason?
Just limited time.
No, but I mean, how many rooms for how many people? Usually you hear.
Oh, of the cabins?
Yeah, the cabins.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I only showed one. That was just a matter of time. I do, in fact, have thousands of photographs. I can tell you about the insides, at these particular sites. So in Oakland, the 2 cabins when I began in 2008 were locked and had nothing in them. And after several years, they had small-scale exhibits that would be opened at certain times of the day or upon request. And this was articulated as being a result of, resource limitations. And there are very real resource limitations. Same at Magnolia, there was no on-site personnel. Magnolia belonged to the National Park Service, like Oakland, but it was about 7 or 8 miles down the road. And only in the summer would somebody be there occasionally. And there was typically, certainly at the start, 2007-8, no access into the cabins. But when there was access, there was nothing in there. And then eventually they put on some small exhibits with 1 or 2 images from a Library of Congress. Melrose, you saw, Cammie Henry's Weaver's cabin had, a lot of material. It had a weaving machine. It had photographs of local white women who had helped create that kind of thing. So again, similar information on along that kind of binary.
Just one addition. Maybe we talk about what happened after emancipation, because I remember seeing things like newspaper to seal gaps in the walls, for instance, because the boarding, you wouldn't have enough boarding to. So they don't just stay.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. So that's actually thanks a lot, Angela. So after slavery ends, well, first of all, the majority of cabins were destroyed by the end of the Civil War. Many of them were burnt down to use firewood to stay warm. Some of them were destroyed for in anger or in retaliation on either side. The ones that survived, and I have an estimate of the number in the book, it slips my mind, they were reorganized for basically black people who had been enslaved, who are now legally free, and who continue to work on the plantations and live in the quarters. And the phrase the quarters became a far more common name than the idea of slave cabins. And some of the docents at the plantation said, look, these cabins existed far longer after slavery than they did during slavery, because they were built. And therefore, this is, why should we focus primarily on the slave cabins? And I said, you have a point, it's open to interpretation. But I get that point, okay? But the cabins were changed, so some of them were made bigger. Some of them that had been for two families were reorganized so they could have one family. There was limited material, so, newspapers and other bits and pieces were used to fill in holes. Some of them eventually got glass. There are some reports of how these quarters changed over time. So in the book, I have detailed descriptions of these cabins, what they look like and so on. But, no plumbing, no indoor toilets, no things. Oh, yeah, and that reminds me, at some of these sites, but not the ones in Nakatosh, at some of the other sites, the cabins are used as toilets, at the contemporary site. So they'd just be described as a toilet. And there would be a sign saying, used to be slave cabin. So again, this is, I regard this as an institutionalization of contempt. But did you finish your question? Yeah. With regard to the prisons, I don't know much about, prisons built on plantations, but the photograph I showed you of the so-called African house, the tremendous structure, that was used as a prison for enslaved people. And, whether enslaved people were put in prison or not, varied depending on the crime, but also because it deprived the so-called master enslaver of access to their labor. So we're just told it's a prison, but no information is given.
This is more current.
Yeah.
Purpose on the radio, some person did a study of this, and his name I think is well known, and he's talking about current prisons, not prisons in the past.
Okay, yeah, I wouldn't doubt it.
Couple questions coming in on Zoom, so let me go to one of those and then I'll go to you. Monique, one of our alums, is saying Angola prison is one of those that was on plantation. And she has a question for both of you, Professor Small and Professor Taylor. What are your thoughts of Nicole Hannah Jones' language of forced labor camps? So it's not in regard to the prisons, but in regard to plantations.
As a phrase, in some of the writing I've done with colleagues in the Netherlands, they have called plantations forced labor camps. And in order to highlight that this was essential, and so in some respects, the central aspect of plantations, following Eric Williams saying that they were primarily economic institutions that use race as a mechanism for domination and control. When some of my colleagues in the Netherlands mentioned that, there was some pushback that it separates them from the historical situation of being plantations. So I wouldn't like to throw out the idea of calling them plantations and emphasizing the primarily that economic exploitation, gendered economic exploitation was central. So I wouldn't get rid of that, and I wouldn't be happy just to call them labor camps. Well, it could be, both could be mentioned. I don't know how you feel.
I agree with you. I wouldn't be happy just calling them forced labor camps, even though economic exploitation was at the vortex of what was happening, because I think that it could push the cultural and the psychological happenings in those spaces aside.
Yeah.
And the institution of slavery.
Yeah.
There.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. I've attended hundreds of these kinds of events, and rarely is it quite so evocative. And I want to ask 1,000 questions. A couple of years ago, maybe more than that, maybe over a decade ago, I ran into people who were interested in and excited about buying plantations in the South, and they talked about the lifestyle, how sort of gracious it would be, and I was kind of wondering, is there a relationship between what your the heritage tours and so forth, that the institutionalization of these museums contrasted to the real estate business of selling them, and that's one thing. And the other thing, it's hard to sit here and not think about the Florida, Florida, and the attempt to, in effect, institutionalize in terms of education the kinds of whitewashing that you demonstrate there, and I'm wondering if the institutions, the heritage tour world, is in any way addressing that kind of attempt to institutionalize what gets taught in education.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me take the second part first. Yeah, of course, we deplore what's happening in Florida. I think we recognize that it's just an extreme of what's happening in many other places around the country, and it's not entirely unique. The heritage sites clearly, I first began in 1994, and the heritage sites have clearly improved in very significant ways. They're still very bad, but they're far better than they were before. Okay, when I did research in the 90s, there were very few cabins that were mentioned or addressed in that. And these changes have happened in part because of criticism, in part because of increased professionalism at conferences and more critique and self-critique. They clearly have an impact on schools because children and school children are a very substantial proportion of the visitors. In some ways, they're at opposite ends of the spectrum. In the summer, tens of thousands of grandparents show up on buses and coaches with their grandchildren, while the middle level people are not really there. So there's various kind of levels on a continuum. Are heritage site people actively challenging education? They're certainly producing books, they're producing work, they're producing some kinds of challenges. But I don't want to comment on that beyond Nakatosh for the moment. In terms of your first issue, purchasing, look, everywhere you drive in the South, you see plantation road, plantation village, plantation court, plantation gardens. It's ubiquitous, it's pervasive. Whether buying as a name of residences and areas, whether buying plantations, these places are not cheap. Some of the plantations are working plantations. The three that I mentioned are not, but there's others across Louisiana. There are working plantations that still produce cotton. Are people buying them? It wouldn't surprise me for the reasons that you suggest. But I will mention one, which is a plantation that's getting a lot of attention in the last 10 years, and that's the Whitney plantation. And this plantation opened around 2013. It was purchased by a white man. I somehow think he was Australian, but I'm not entirely sure. And his representations of slavery is diametrically opposed to pretty much everything else across Louisiana. Black people are first and foremost. He has detailed documentation. He has tremendous information on cabins. And everyone who's commented on that site, who's let me know, they praise it. People ask me, does that mean everything's changing? I say, no, it doesn't. It's a highly exceptional anomalous case, but it's a good case because it throws into stark contrast. Eula?
I'm gonna be honest. I'm still holding on to your statement that some former slave cabins are current toilets. I'm still holding on to that. I'm not quite sure what to do with that right now. So I did hear what you were saying, but I must confess, I'm still holding on to that.
Well, that is a good segue to another question that came in via Zoom from Laura Heska, who says, thank you to both Dr. Eula Taylor and Professor Stephen Small for your contributions. Certainly left me with much food for thought, and I can't wait to read the book. I think there's another book to be written specifically on people wanting to sleep in and go to the bathroom in, that's my addition, and rewrite the history of slave cabins and plantation land in general. For example, enslaved quarters in Rose Hall, Jamaica, is a honeymoon suite.
Oh, yeah.
My question is, how do we stop this as a collective?
Cool. Okay. Well, first of all, let me say thank you, Laura, for zooming in. As far as I know, Laura is zooming in from Liverpool, England. She's a PhD student at Liverpool University, just finished her master's degree. So thank you. This is an issue for psychologists. There's a lot and collective psychology. You have to laugh because you cry. To be able to understand how tens of thousands of people could sleep. I mean, the toilet, when you gotta go, I suppose. And why, I think a very small number of these sites have toilets. They are real and they are offensive. Okay. So there is a book to be written on that. I'm not going to write that book. When I did the work with Jennifer Eichstadt, she wanted us to interview people. I said, I don't have the emotional energy to hear what people have to say about how good things have developed. And, we heard people say, well, these are not so bad. These cabins, they didn't have. So, it's a serious issue. And Laura's question is about, whiteness and processing whiteness during the afterlives of slavery. I hope somebody does it. I think it would be welcome. It may be Tim Wise. I don't know if you read any of his work. He has some good insights into white psychology and growing up as a Southern, working class white person.
Well, I think the video that you picked out is an example of resistance to that. I mean, that's one way to fight it, right?
Yeah.
Is by,
Oh yeah, I forgot. I'm sorry. Yeah. So she did ask, what do we do? Here's my position. In Liverpool, a lot of people, when that gallery was announced, a lot of people said, look, we haven't got time. Black people said, we haven't got time to work with this museum. Black men are being killed on the street. The police are doing this. Our children are suffering. We're not going to get involved. And I was particularly aware that a number of Black women said, listen, our children have to deal with this nonsense. They didn't use that language at the time, but they said, these are colonizing life. When our children go to these museums and see these issues, they have to deal with them. And we are, some men stayed involved, but there was a higher proportion of women. So the issue is, where do you position yourself given the wide range of assaults upon Black people? And what I argue, what I write at the end of one of my articles is, listen, museum representations are not the most important obstacle to Black people's lives right now. We know there are plethora of other issues that are daily affecting us. However, I think it's important that there are Black people and others who recognize that these museums and heritage sites play a role, and we should appreciate that people are involved in them. You know, I have friends who are saying, black friends who say, why are you wasting your time on me? I was in Liverpool and a friend said, why is everybody wasting the time on heritage when black people are facing mental health? So it's all about the relative. So, you know, we encourage people to be involved, but you have to decide where your priorities are. Oh, as my friend Barna Hesse said, you can't start everywhere. You have to start somewhere. It's a great phrase.
Thank you both for your presentations. I was intrigued by Clementine Hunter, who I had actually never encountered her art before. And I just wondered if you could say a little more about, is this is part of a counter narrative, and is her art spreading and influential, or is it really sequestered and suppressed?
You know, I can't comment. I don't know that. I really would appeal to colleagues in my department and grad students who have far more skill in the analysis of these kinds of art and visual representations, like, you know, Professor Lee Rayford, who has worked on these areas. There are some grad students. You know, I come at it as a sociologist, political economist, looking at the potential, but I really don't have the language. It would be, I think, relatively straightforward to find out, you know, where art is being exhibited, what kind of impacts it's happening. I know there was at least one student in the department.
Yes, Ra Malika Imhotep wrote a dissertation that has a chapter on Hunter's art.
Yeah.
And in it, if I remember correctly, she points out how toward the end of Hunter's life, there were a lot of fraudulent representations of her work.
Forgeries, yeah.
A lot of forgeries where, you know, she was forced to, you know, put her signature, and how the whole idea that since the art is centered in the so-called primitive genre, that anybody can do it, right? And therefore it's easy to make, you know, these replicas of her work.
And that's before AI.
Oh, exactly.
So you know, it has potential, and you know, there are a lot of people working on these issues. It also raises the other issue of what I call, in simple terms, non-documentary evidence, meaning, you know, in the so-called traditional archives, written documents and all that. We have a lot of oral history in the US from black people and in the diaspora. I used a lot of work from anthropologists and archaeologists on the kinds of material evidence and art that was left by black people that outright challenged the documents that are available by white people. For example, Maria Franklin, who's at University of Texas, she said that in some plantations, the whites would say, our slaves, to use their phrase, are well-fed, they're happy, they're trustworthy. But when you find materials, and they're Christian, but when you dig the ground, you find materials of African gods and African religious and spiritual. You find food that was captured, and bones. And so what they argue, Maria Franklin and Teresa Singleton, is that material evidence is not a precursor to documentary evidence, but is superior. And this is where we can find the potential in looking at these kinds of materials and these documents. But, you know, your question is great. There are other people who are working on those kinds of issues. And I think it's a good question.
I think we need a museum of whitewashing.
Yeah.
Isn't that every?
Yeah.
Or almost every. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I invite those of you here in the room with us to stay for informal conversation, refreshments, book purchases, and signing. Thank you all so much for coming, and a final thank you.
Thank you.